Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Science Dispatch podcast. This is episode 45. I am your host, as always, Cameron English, joined, as I usually am, by Dr. Chuck Dinnerstein, Director of Medicine at the American Council on Science and Health. Chuck, how are you this lovely day?
I'm fantastic. Beautiful day.
I am very glad to hear that. I apologize, everybody, if the audio quality isn't great. I'm traveling this week with my family. And all I have is my Bluetooth earbuds, so I don't have my fancy microphone. So if it's not as great quality, I'm sorry, but I'm hanging out at the ocean, which is takes precedence sometimes, especially during the Father's Day season. By the way, Chuck, happy Father's Day, since I know
Same to you and the fathers in all of us.
Absolutely, everyone. I hope you enjoy some time with your families. Use this as an excuse to buy yourself a little something. Second birthday, as I like to call it.
There we go. It's funny because I was working on our Saturday newsletter, and I write something about Father's Day, and I discovered that, as Rodney Dangerfield says, we just don't get respect. Mother's Day was taken in as a holiday very quickly, and it took well over 50 years for them to decide to make Father's Day a holiday too.
We finally, after all of these decades, Chuck, have gender equality when it comes to the holidays.
There we go.
We fight on, people. You never give up the battle for equality. It's that important. But while we go on fighting for equal rights when it comes to Mother's Day and Father's Day, let's talk about some science. We've got two stories, as always. Chuck, you're the author of both these stories this week, which is kind of cool. First one is called Breaking Down the Sucralose Study. And, of course, everyone saw the headlines. Sucralose supposedly causes cancer, which is a pretty big claim, so we're going to look at the research there. And then Chuck wrote the second story called Time to Pay the Piper, which has to do with reparations, to use an actual term from the I guess it's an opinion piece. But yeah, it's time to pay reparations apparently for climate change. So we'll get into that in just a little bit. Chuck, let me read the intro here. This is the story you wrote with our resident toxicologist, Susan Goldhaber. So you say, can a degradation product and chemical used to make sucralose, and that's Splenda, just the off-the-shelf name for that fancy sweetener everyone uses, chemicals called sucralose-6-acetate, can these chemicals damage your DNA? As is often the case, it depends, Chuck writes, on your metric of DNA damage and your exposure. Leaving the scary headlines and media confabulation behind, here's a breakdown of the study. Okay, so with that very brief intro, Chuck, break down this paper for us. What did they do, and what did they actually find versus what the newspapers told us they found?
Okay, so I'm going to follow along a little bit with what I wrote because I learned a lot of new vocabulary words on this article. And the key word is clastogenicity, which is a very fancy way of saying it's the ability of a substance to induce chromosomal damage, breaks in the DNA, something like that. Now, we have an innate system of repair because our ability to replicate our DNA is not without its fault. So the body does have a way to repair DNA, but these are changes that come from a chemical or some other substance that causes a breakage in that. And as I hasten to point out, clastogenicity, the breaking of DNA, is not synonymous with the development of cancer. Cancer requires a number of other contributing factors, and it's certainly not the sole cause. But for susceptible individuals, clastogenic changes may lead to further problems, especially depending upon the dose and the duration of the chemical that's giving them the problem. So with that said, what the scientists did is looked at sucralose-6-acetate, which is a product used in the synthesis of sucralose, and it's also appears to be a breakdown product from storage. It's also a product that's broken down by our gut metabolism, too. They went ahead and they applied three different tests to look at the degree of clastogenicity, DNA breakdown, coming from sucralose and sucralose-6-acetate. So I'm going to really stick to sucralose-6-acetate because sucralose itself was not an issue. The classic test is called the Ames test, and it looks to see whether the substance causes mutations in two forms of bacteria. And in that instance, there was no changes. And the Ames test is a pretty standard test used by the FDA and the EPA in evaluating chemicals. So that test was normal. There was no finding of any problems. There's two other tests. One's called a mammalian cell micronucleus test, where you look for evidence of DNA fragments in the nucleus. And this has a sensitivity of about 75%, a specificity of about 30%. So pretty much on par with the Ames test, which I would really kind of describe as flipping a coin in terms of getting an answer. And in that case, they did find that the sucralose was genotoxic at a very concentrated dose over about a 27-hour period. So that's a key thought to hold on mind. The last test they looked at is a test called the multi-flow cytometry, which is a new test. It hasn't been validated for regulatory science, but I think that it's something that we probably should consider, and I'll get back to in a minute. And for that, they did find that there were clastogenic changes to the sucralose-6 acetate, and that the lowest concentration of that was somewhere around 300 micrograms per milliliter. So their first conclusion was that the sucralose-6 acetate can cause breakdown in DNA. And I think that that's a fair conclusion to come to based on the science that's there. I don't have any real pressing issue fighting about the data as far as that goes. But it comes, as always, with caveats. And the big caveats have to do with the dose that was involved and the exposure, how long they were exposed. And that brings us to their narrative. And at that point, for my money, things get off the rail a little bit. So I'm going to take a quote from it. A single serving of a sucralose-containing drink may contain levels of sucralose-6 acetate that exceed a TTC, that's threshold of toxicological concern, of 15 micrograms per person per day by several order of magnitudes. The difficulty with that particular statement is the fact that a TTC is a good predictor, but is not used when there is already data available. And in the case of sucralose, this has been approved by the U.S., it's been approved by Canada, Asia, and and the strictest of all, the Europeans have also approved sucralose. So applying something that's called a threshold of toxicological concern has no bearing here. We're already past that point in regulation. The other statement they make is that the repeated daily doses enhances exposure because this impurity was reported to persist in the body for at least 11 days after cessation of taking the sucralose. Well, that again is a legitimate concern. Are these drugs accumulated over time? The problem, of course, with this particular statement was that the bodies that they were talking about were 10 rats. And the dose that they were given was far greater than anything that a human being might ingest. I did the calculations, and the dose that they were giving the rat every day was equivalent to 18 liters of sucralose-sweetened beverages. I think you would probably die from fluid intoxication long before the sucralose-6 acetate got you. So that too is a little bit concerning. So I left it as follows. I think that the tests do reveal some genotoxicity. It's certainly worthwhile using this test because it is faster and more helpful in screening. A positive test would then require testing in lab animals, from my point of view. But it certainly would perhaps increase the throughput of drugs going through the system. But the difficulty with the study is that the doses that they're talking about are just pretty much made up. If you're thinking about what you're going to eat along with your 18 liters of soda, you can also consider eating 35 cakes sweetened with sucralose, because that contains the same amount as the 18 liters. Again, no one's going to eat this kind of stuff. So, if the dose makes the poison, this dose is way, way greater than anything we can concern ourselves with. As a note about the media spent a lot of time confusing sucralose with sucralose-6-acetate. They're different compounds, though they are related. And more importantly, they tended to obscure the fact that genetic changes are not consistent necessarily with the development of cancer. And that's the study.
So what I found most fascinating about this, Chuck, is the framing of the article. Because as I read it, it seems to me what they're doing is they're taking and not to be rude here, but I'm just going to say it, a fairly useless piece of research that probably isn't going to have much impact. And they're framing it as this sort of groundbreaking approach to looking at this chemical. And to your point just a minute ago, they talk about how this metabolite of sucralose hasn't been very thoroughly studied. So they say, all these regulatory agencies have looked at sucralose and they say that it's safe for consumption at the doses it's approved. But no one's looked at this specific question. And I found that angle amusing because you say in the story, quoting them, the potential adverse health effects have not yet been identified in the scientific literature. So their spin was, well, that's because, nobody's looking for this super secret mechanism that we found, don't you know? And your answer was, well, if there was something there, somebody almost certainly would have looked at it given the, hundreds of studies. I know the FDA looked at something like 115 studies in order to approve sucralose for human consumption. And that's just a fraction of the literature that has been published related to this chemical. So what are your thoughts there?
I agree. I mean, my only hesitancy is I hate to throw the baby out with the bathwater in the sense that I think that it's probably worth reconsidering the test that we use to determine whether a particular chemical or drug has an effect on our genes. The Ames test is it's been there for thousands of millions of years at this point. But as I said, its sensitivity and specificity is not great. Mm-hmm. So technology has improved. I think that there's something to be said for this multi-flow cytometry. It's not, I don't think it gives us the definitive answer, but I think that it is more quickly done and helps screen things. It will save on doing animal studies, which take a long time to do, let alone what we do to the animals. So I think that's the baby. The bathwater is the part about how this is a concern in terms of causing cancer, and we must act with all due haste. But I think that is what we do nowadays in order to get attention for our articles, because an article saying this is a better technique and we should use it is not going to make it into the mainstream media. It may make it into one of the media covering this specialized area, but it would never get the play that it got on CNN and U.S. News World Report and USA Today and everywhere else.
Yeah, everybody covered it, and it's always the same story. But nobody talks about the methodology. Nobody talks about the nuance and the limitations. It's just this chemical you eat might give you cancer. It's the same story, just copy and paste. For, I don't know, 30 or 40 years now. It's been the same thing. But, and maybe, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it takes a lot more work to dig through the article, especially when it's not quite your area. I mean, if you take their statement at face value when they talk about these bodies that had accumulation, you would think that they were talking about humans. And they cite it. And if you go look at the citations, it's only then that you discover we're talking about rats. And it's only then that you discover how massive a dose they were being given. So it does take a while to dig through these things and get to all the nitty-gritty details that make up the context of that. And in general, in our 24/7 news cycle, nobody has the time and or inclination to do that.
Yeah. Well, another thing too is that a lot of these, not all of them, but some of the tests they were doing, they were performed on um, immortalized cell lines. So
Yes.
in other words, these are cancerous cells because they will continually divide, so you can run experiments on them. So you're already one step removed in an important way from a functioning healthy body.
Yes.
And then, of course, the cells are not surrounded by the various tissues and organs and everything, and they're not functioning as part of an overall system. They're just sitting in a petri dish, and you're effectively pouring sucralose on them. and
Yes. Well, it's funny, and we're entering the era of the organoid,
right.
um, where we have layers of cells that we can attempt to mimic how they are structured inside an organ. But that again is a level of hubris that we should reconsider. So I think that the structure of our organs may be more complex than we realize at this point. It's another one of those unknowns.
One other thing before we move on, this has to do with the dose thing, because I started looking into some other studies that had been done on sucralose, and one of the reviews I found from 2020 said in order to find any kind of harmful effect, you have to expose cells or rodents or whatever whatever you're using in your study to absurd doses of this stuff. And so in this paper I was looking at, and it's basically what you said earlier, they said, you have to give rodents 1,100 times the dose or even higher than that of what humans are allowed to do anything. So, and that's why I was saying this is effectively useless, because I mean, you showed that this test works, but maybe you just need more realistic conditions before this is useful to anybody.
Yeah, it would be nice to try it in a manner that more closely follows what goes on. When you talk about putting a dose against an intestinal wall for 27 hours, the drug is not going to hang around at these high concentrations in your gut for 27 hours. It's not it's not a physiologic behavior on our part. And the half-life of this drug is in the range of about 38 minutes. So it's cleared. 97% of it is cleared in 3 hours. So there's not a lot hanging around, I guess, unless you're, really making the attempt to get those 18 liters in.
It's funny, and I think I got this from our colleague, Dr. Josh Bloom, but there seems to be a trend between the complexity of a study and how important its conclusions are. This tends to be the case. The more complex the experiments, the longer the discussion section, the more analysis there is. It seems that they're stretching the results ever thinner with every paragraph in the paper. That seems to be what's happening here.
Interesting approach. I like it.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll leave that there. Read Chuck's article. Again, this is why I think what ACSH does is so useful, is because, Chuck spends 15, 20 hours, whatever it took to figure out what was actually going on. And you probably were dumber after reading the news stories based on this research. So yeah, take a look at that in your own time. I think it's educational. But let's move on here, Chuck. This is your story from June 12th. It's called "Time to Pay the Piper?" And you write in the summary, "How to manage climate change remains a contested national and international policy area. Who will pick up the tab for the changes? One group of scientists has taken the moral high ground," and they write, you're quoting them, they say, "Other agents bear substantial responsibility for the cost of redressing climate harm. The companies that engage in exploration, production, refining, and distribution of oil, gas." Okay, so the oil industry, in essence, owes the world a bunch of money, is what they're saying here. So dive into their argument for us.
Okay, so reparations are getting to be very popular, especially in your state.
Yes.
But we'll let that go. But first of all, this is an opinion piece. So there's not a lot of statistics built into it. They did do a little bit of math along the way. And I don't have any problem with the bias in an opinion piece because that's in fact what it's about. But I did find their bias fairly interesting. And they wrote that in the case of the carbon fuel industry, reparations require that companies relinquish part of their tainted wealth. And I thought, tainted wealth, God, I haven't heard that since we've been talking about Purdue Pharma in terms of tainted money. So right away, there's a tone in there. And they argued that the fossil fuel producers contributed to climate harm through their operational and product emissions. Fair enough. I'll give them that. But if we're going to require reparations based on harm, then shouldn't we at least counterbalance it with whatever benefits it might have given us? Could we, say, deduct the cost of fueling fire engines and fueling ambulances or fueling healthcare systems? Those are all goods that come from the use of fossil fuel, but those don't seem to be accounted for in any way. The fact that we use the fuel is enough to be a harm. And I think that that's really becomes a difficulty. So they then decided who should bear culpability for this. And they came up with three groups of people, but they focused on one. The three groups of people that are responsible for the reparations are the producers of this fossil fuel, the consumers of the fossil fuel, and the political authorities, i.e. the nation states that allow this to going on. And they gave each group a third, which is about $23 trillion each. What they did at that point was very fancifully looked at how much oil was being produced by the various companies and charged them a tithe to pay it off. Again, I mean, when we're talking in the abstract, this has some interest to it, but the problem is that they made exceptions for certain people. So Saudi Arabia, which produces the most oil, was given the highest reparations to pay. Second in line, I'm just going to kind of quickly looking to make sure I get my numbers lined up, was ExxonMobil. And as far as they were concerned, ExxonMobil has to pay full tilt. Now, as it turns out, the Russian companies make the exact same amount of fossil fuel that's made by ExxonMobil. But because Russia is a poorer country, they only have to pay half of their share of the reparations. The same was also true in their mind for China. So you know from a political point of view that the chance of Russia and China getting off by paying less it is going to be a non-starter there. And the other interesting thing about China, which they ranked as a poor country and therefore entitled to its 50% reduction, is they didn't even take into account the fact that nearly 57% of all of China's energy comes from coal, which is certainly harmful to the environment. So that wasn't even calculated in. So we're only considering fossil fuel. Coal is okay. So it's any number of these little caveats and exceptions that they make that become problematic over time. So I was left with two thoughts. One thought was they have a caveat early on that they choose to ignore a number of problems, like who are the victims, how are we going to pay them, how is that money going to be distributed, and is this politically feasible? So this is just a pie-in-the-sky dream about how things might go. I don't even know if it's even in an ideal world, but certainly not in the real world. And that got me to my second comment, so I'll quote myself. Real-world economics say that it might be shareholders, taxpayers, or investors who wind up paying for this, but that obscures the real-world fact that all those people are you and you alone. Depending on how many hats you wear, taxpayer, big oil consumer, pensioner, or shareholder, you're ultimately the one that's going to pay the piper, not these other companies. So this is just a silly exercise.
Yeah, it seems to me a little more than moral preening. It's just something along the lines of we're here to point out who the bad guy is. And the bad guy is, surprise, it's the bad guy we've told you about for 25, 30 years now. And,
Right.
it's only bad guys in the West, apparently, which is strange. And the thing about that caveat in particular, Chuck, is what you pointed out earlier, right? The whole premise of this is we need to punish the people who are responsible for causing the climate crisis, quote unquote. Um, but a bunch of these guys, for one reason or another, we're going to exclude them because they don't have any money that we can tax, or
Right.
they're from the wrong country. It's just so amusing to me. It's like we have the hubris to declare that we're going to call balls and strikes, and you're the bad guy, you're the victim. But our methodology and our standards, they don't count for half of the world's population, probably more.
Right.
I don't.
We will change the size of the strike zone depending upon who is at bat.
Right.
And and that's it's just crazy town. But I see more and more of these articles now appearing. I guess reparations has become a big thing, and they've been talking a great deal about doing it. But they all say it's out of our area of expertise how this should be done. We're just letting you know. These are the evil people, and they need to be punished. And this is what we believe is a fair rate. But you go ahead and you manage it from there. I think this may be one of those times when the scientists are getting out of their lane,
Right.
to use an old phrase. If they can come up with some answers to the mechanism to pay for it and how it's going to be distributed and how we're all going to come to an agreement, fine. Then let's have that conversation. But if they're going to leave those parts out, then this is just, playing with math and writing a paper to signal your virtue, that you care about the environment more than some other guy.
Yeah, and this 23 trillion figure, I don't think we need to get into how that was calculated, but it is sort of funny to me. They're like, yeah, here's this and this is larger than some of the economies of entire countries. And so they're like, yeah, here's this very precise figure. You figure out how you're going to penalize people.
Now, to be fair, they gave us 20 years to pay it. So, it's not 23 trillion right away. You can
Oh, yeah. Well, I got a piggy bank over here, so I'll start adding to that,
There you go. You're going to have to.
The thing I'm curious about, and it goes to your point earlier about the value of fossil fuels, and this tends to get glossed over in the conversation. I'm not sure why. I guess it makes people uncomfortable, but fossil fuels power everything, and it's not just energy. Most consumer products are derived from or contain something, some kind of fossil fuel or some chemical derivative or whatever, and it's valuable stuff. It's like blood bags and blister packs for medication and air conditioning for my pregnant wife. It's like things that save lives and ventilators. It's like everything,
Right.
So what I don't get is, because the whole thing with climate change is, right, this is a crisis. This is going to cost lives. This is going to destroy societies. But we're not going to talk about the life-saving aspects of the technology that maybe deserves a little bit of criticism in the right context. So what do you think about that specifically?
Oh, I think you're 100% correct. If you're going to do a cost-benefit analysis, then it's fine. We've identified the cost. Now let's discuss some of the benefits, and they're equally difficult to abstract. Now, in a tease, just to talk about something that I'm writing up that's going to come out in the next week or so, some other economists decided to look at how humans as a global society spend their time. And they looked basically at the work we do and made use of government statistics on how much time is spent at any given job. And they put that into to limit things into a 24-hour day. Now, the thing that humans do the most is sleep. Nearly 9 hours out of that 24-hour day, the people of the planet Earth sleep. So what I found very fascinating is when they calculated the amount of time that we spend extracting resources from the planet. That would be oil and other raw materials. And that's about a minute and a half out of a 24-hour day. So I thought that was, we spend far more time sleeping, eating, and grooming than we spend on all the other things that benefit our societies. And so and maybe we can shift the time around and find some other ways to extract things that are less harmful, or find other things to extract, or find ways to recycle them to change that around. But I thought it was so interesting to see just a time clock put to all of our global activities. And you would think that you would think from the headlines and the way fossil fuels are causing the climate to shift that we were spending a majority of our time on this, and it comes down to minutes. a fraction of the global day is spent in that. Now, of course, that measures productivity and efficiency too, but we'll let that ride.
There's such a range of analyses here, and just to give people a sense of the scope, I'm looking at an article by an economist named Robert P. Murphy. And in some of the research he's done, he talks about the cost of implementing all of the mitigation measures that the IPCC recommends, that various experts recommend. And he points out that the cost, if we were to do everything, and of course there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of math magic, as you're wont to say, Chuck. But one of the points he makes is that it would actually cost us more in economic terms to solve climate change than it would to just sit around and kick our feet up as the temperature rises, So, I mean, it almost seems like you can reach whatever conclusion you want using whatever model you want. And I don't know. I don't mean to sound too cynical, but it just seems people pick and choose, and whatever they want to be the narrative that prevails, that's what they're going to try to push, whatever the data may show. I don't know. Am I being too cynical here?
Well, you have to at some point thread the data together, because all these are just data points. And so I understand why people do it to form a narrative, but I think it's also useful to look at counter narratives to it. And with the reparations article, it's easy. They never counted any benefits. And the world runs on fossil fuels. Even if tomorrow we switch completely to electricity, we still use fossil fuels as lubricants in all of our mechanical objects. All those electric cars use fossil fuels because otherwise the parts don't move.
Right.
And it's these things that the economic term is externalities, that we treat as externalities, that we don't count in our model, that can make a significant difference. Another example, if you talk about the atmosphere, the atmospheric models have not until recently taken into account the effect of clouds, because we do not understand the effect of clouds. And so we may be off in a completely wrong direction in terms of what we need to do, just because our models are too simple for the reality of the planet. The planet has been here a lot longer than us, and it has developed its own interconnected system that we're just barely scratching at.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I think people get the impression with any kind of modeling that it's sort of like it's an interactive screen and you turn one dial and then, the clouds get bigger or smaller.
Right.
And in reality, it's just lines of computer code. And
right. And in fact, we just added the cloud dial the other day, and we're not really quite sure when you turn it up, what happens.
Right. Yeah, there's and I mean, we're getting off in left field a little bit, but that's okay. It's our show. We do what we want. There was a study years ago when talking about climate modeling, and the authors made the point that when you adjust the models to reflect past temperature records, you screw up their future extrapolations, so it's like two sides of an equation. It's not static, I guess. It's not like, well, you turn the dial and then, you change just one variable. It's like, no, you turn the dial and then you affect 4 or 5 variables and it alters everything that you're analyzing, so there's a complexity here that most people don't understand, I think.
Right. And another fine example this week, I had a conversation with Dr. Lipford, who writes on pollutants for us and does a lot of his own research out of publicly available data. And he sent me a note. He was very excited. He discovered a huge peak in temperature several decades ago that we just never talk about anymore. And, what was it? It was the Dust Bowl in the early 30s. The temperatures were peak. And that's large part of what caused the drought and the Dust Bowl. But that's just, and that's within recent memory of some individuals, but gets lost. We just don't think about it, use it anymore. Yeah. Which is not to say that I'm not trying to say that the climate is not changing, because I suspect that it is. What's causing it? There are multiple factors involved, but this has been going on for some time now.
Right. Yeah, I think that's part of the problem is the way the discussion is framed is, and I know it's been this way for a long, long time, in that you had one side that said, no, this is fake, this is a liberal conspiracy. And then you had the other side that says, you're a science denier, you're a kook, you just love money and you're greedy. And it's the same framing with so many issues. But I think that really caused a problem in that you're not allowed to ask certain questions or push back in a certain way. Meanwhile, you have people saying ExxonMobil's portion of the bill is $23 trillion for all the evil they've done. We live in this absurd world where it seems that you just can't address certain things in any sensible way.
It's true.
All right, folks. Well, we'll leave it there for the week. Check out both of these articles. Let me give you the titles one more time. First is called Time to Pay the Piper, and this is the story we've just been discussing about climate change reparations. And then the first story was called the Sucralose, or Breaking Down the Sucralose Study, excuse me. These are both very helpful, Chuck. Your writing is always pretty good, but I appreciate these and that you're sort of diving into the methods of these various pieces of work, which is good for people to get a sense of. So thank you as always. Yeah, good stuff. All right, well, we'll be back next week for episode 46. But in the meantime, follow us on social media. The organization is at ACSH.org. I'm at CamJEnglish. Chuck doesn't Twitter, doesn't tweet, doesn't social post. So you just got to reach out to the organization. But we'll make sure that your questions or your comments or even your insults get to Chuck so he can respond accordingly.
They get there right away. My children collect.
That's right. The Dinnerstein family sits down for dinner every weekend, and they go over the hurtful things.
Look what they said about him this week.
Yeah. All right, folks. Thank you for joining us. As always, all the dads out there, have a great Father's Day, and we will see you next time.
Take care.